Hi. Aw. So this is a talk about observable and at published. It's not about the publishing industry. A couple program notes. If you've never seen me speak, there's a lot of code. The code doesn't matter. The idea is the code tells a story, and the ideas are. I was recently told backstage that we couldn't hate on technology, so I would like to point out the Combine is not dead. It hasn't even been deprecated. It's still around. But if I was creating a new project today, and I am, I use Observable. And in fact, for existing projects, I've been moving them over to Observable, and it's amazing. So let's start simple. Well, it's not observable yet. Okay, so let's start with some local state. If I keep my state locally, one thing, again, I do, if you haven't seen me speak, is I tend to split view code into two pieces. I put the struct, the memory footprint at the top, and the part that conforms to the view at the bottom, just to separate the two. And so at the top, let's add a property, count, and count is just an int. We'll start it out with 0. And then on screen, I'd like a body, and it's a V stacking on top. I'd like to have text, and on the bottom, I'll have a button that says next. And it looks like this. It looks like this. You guys better loosen up a little bit. So let's give the button an action, and I'll put that in an extension, and I'll have a private method called change count, and that's what I'll call as my button's action. And you've been here before. You can see we're headed for a problem, because if I modify count, this doesn't compile. And you say, oh, I'm brand new to Swift UI. Maybe it's the let. And the person next to you goes, oh, you're new to Swift UI. But you go, I know what to do. I'll change the let to a var, and that will fix everything. And it doesn't, because buttons can't take mutating methods. Oh. So we have to move it, and we do it with this at state. And so count becomes an at state property. And now when I launch, it's this. And when I tap the button, it's this. Feeble, but I'll take it. Content view, I started by storing the count in the content view, but content view is a struct, and the problem is I can't modify a property in a struct without modifying the struct. So what state does is it stores the int somewhere else. And so the reference, wait, I have a value type that's a reference. Work with me here. The reference doesn't change, the count changes, but it's changing somewhere off of the content view, and so it's fine. Oh my God, Daniel, we know this. I know. We're starting in the world we know and moving to the world we don't know. Views are cheap, and so one of the reasons that we do this is our view could go away. And if our view goes away and our count changes, then the view needs to come back to display that change. And so the view comes back, and then the connection is made. Notice the view is told the count will change. That's important. The will part is very important. And now the connection is made, and we see on the screen the changes. And so views get thrown out all the time, and we don't think about that. And so things get reconstituted. And so that's how this text count.description works. And that's when the state was in the view. Everyone happy? Yes, we are, Daniel. Thanks for asking. You're not observable yet, but you are audible. Okay. So a lot of this code that we have right now isn't view code, and so let's move it out of the view. For now, I'm going to move it to the controller. Oh, we don't call it a controller. Oh, we don't call it I don't care what you call it. I'm going to call it a controller. And so my controller is a class, and it has a count in it. And because I just don't trust you guys, I make it privately settable. And so I have to have in my extension the method that allows you to change the count, and I'll call it, funny enough, change count. and it does the same thing that we were doing in the view, we're just doing it here. Okay? We've moved the controller out of the view. We have to reconnect the view. The view needs to know it's talking to the controller. And so I create an instance of the controller. Instead of using the counts description, because the count's no longer local, need to ask for the controller's count description. I ask the controller to change the count. And there's one more thing I want to do here, and that is, even though we aren't used to doing it, it's something that came up in the DubDub videos this year. They pointed out that even though this works, we probably should not store this reference locally, because if we recreate it, we might be recreating an instance of the controller. Asterisk, it never actually happens, but we should, and so we'll do it with a state again, and we'll store our reference to the controller offsite even, and so if the view goes away and it comes back, we're not creating a new instance of controller by accident. And so that's what we're avoiding with that. It was something they slipped in real quietly in one of the sessions, but something that we should think about now. And so I'll just put a state there so that we're storing it off. It looks funny to me, but I'm going with it. Okay. There are obviously other problems. If we run the app and we tap the button, we don't see any changes in the view. The controller change count gets called. In the controller, we're calling change count. The count, new random number between 1 and 100. The count changes, but we're not communicating that change back to the view. So the view has no idea that it needs to be redisplayed. The controller's count description just sits there. It doesn't know that it's changed. So this is where we traditionally use combine. Traditionally, like even now, because combine's not dead, but I urge you. And so the way we use combine is we label our count with @published, and that means that count is an int, but $count is a publisher of ints, and often because this is Swift UI, we'll do that inside of the setting of an observable object. And if we use observable object, we import combine, and you say, oh, no, we can import Foundation or Swift UI. That's just you lying to yourselves. That's just you pretending you're not using combine. You are. Those things in turn import combine. I would encourage you to use import combine directly so that you have a note to yourself, I may be wanting to change this in the future. So how does this work? When the count changes, we get an inkling that count's about to change, and @publish sends out a message that says, hey, count's about to change, and observable object says, hey, something inside of me is about to change. And so someone listening to controller gets a note that says, something in the controller instance will change. That's high-cost graphics there. So, it's pressure being the first speaker. Got to warm you guys up. So, someone listening to controller doesn't know that count has changed. All it knows is something in observer changes. And actually, let's be more specific, something will change. There's that will word again. Okay. The change the content view to make this work is trivial. Instead of state, we use state object. State object says, not only do I own controller, I created the instance of controller, I'm interested in knowing when something in controller changed, and so state object receives the changes, and now the app runs perfectly. I'm not going to show it to you because I'm not. It's just the same as before. Oh, okay. Ready to remove combine? So, we're going to remove combine now. And these are the bits in the controller that were combined, and we're going to remove them, and we're going to introduce observable, or as you spell it up here. And Toronto loves observable. Toronto loves watching things that change and reacting. So let's make our controller observable. That's it. Well, we have to import observation, and observable is a macro, and so observable introduces a lot. I'll talk about that in a moment. Let's just use it first. In order to use our observable controller, count needs an initial value. Now we're coming from a published property, so we had an initial value, but if you're just modifying your code and you haven't gone through combine, you might get some warnings and you go, I don't know what your problem is. A property in an observable object needs an initial value. Even an optional. We're used to having an optional automatically be initialized to nil if we don't specify. You have to say it yourself. So now let's go fix the view. And all you have to do is get rid of that object from state object. And now this runs perfectly. We've gotten rid of combine. It runs perfectly. That's all there is to it. We run the app. We tap the button. Life is good. I'm so proud of you. So I said observable was a Swift macro. Swift macros are able to insert a bunch of code for us. Let's see what's been inserted, and you can do that by control clicking on it and expanding the macro, and we get all of this. There's our code. There's what the macro adds. I know. Who says we aren't using ChatGPT? Okay. Here's something that it adds. It adds conformance to the observable protocol. This is just a marker conformance like error. If you conform to error, you don't have to do anything. We're conforming to observable. That's something that the macro gives us. The rest of this reminds me a little bit of when we first got properties in Objective-C. We first got properties in Objective-C, we had to do a lot of the work ourselves, and they built on this sort of habit that we got into where we had an instance variable and we had a getter and we had a setter, so we had these properties and it synthesized these bits for us, and so we got this underscore count. In our case, underscore count is like our instance variable, it's private, and notice that nobody can observe it. The observation is ignored. The other thing that we get is observation is tracked for our actual property. So count, other people can find out when it changes. That's how the view was able to respond to that. And then the third piece, which is kind of cool and secret, is there's an observation registrar. And the observation registrar says, anytime someone even looks at the property or changes the property, let me know so I can let other people know, and by other people, it mainly means SwiftUI. It doesn't care about us, it cares about SwiftUI. Now, here's what the getter looks like. If you get count, then notice you are registering that access with the observation registrar. Similarly, if you set the count to be some other property, you are registering that mutation of count with the registrar. So that's how SwiftUI knows and other pieces know that you have either looked at count, you've accessed count, or you've changed count. So those are added for free. So that's all this code that has been added. This is all that we typed. We added @observable and import observation, and we got all that mechanism for free. And that's how we were able to say when count changes, or when count will change, SwiftUI gets to know about it. So that's for stored properties. What about computed properties? For computed properties, let's make count private so that no one can explicitly watch it. Did it suddenly get quiet in here? Like we're getting to something cool? We are. So count is private, so view can't observe count directly anymore. And I'm going to add in here in an extension, because man, I love extensions, a computed property called annotated count. An annotated count is just going to be a string that I get from count. It's going to say the controller's count is / whatever the count value is. So that's annotated count. Now you might notice that annotated count depends on count. Every time I access it, something inside of that observable is saying to the registrar, hey, someone is looking at you. So I've got observable here. Observable is kind of controlling the stored property, but annotated count is watching count. And when count changes, it can say, hey, I changed too. Don't you want to know what I am now? And so let's adjust the view. It can't use count directly anymore. Count is private, and so it has to use annotated count. And so now my text controller.annotated count, and it works. Now I feel bad. I think I bullied you. All right. So I have my view watching an observable thing that is my controller, and my view is updating when a computed property, which is watching a stored property, changes. And so I want to separate my code further. I want to take the stuff that doesn't look like controller code and move it into a model. Very fake example, very tiny, because it's got to fit on slides in the talk. But I'm getting rid of the model stuff here from my controller, and I'm going to create a model. So here's my model. It's a class. Observable things have to be classes. It has a property count, which is privately settable because I still don't trust you. It has an extension where I can update the count, and there's my model. Okay? Let's modify the controller to use the model. Instead of creating my count locally, my controller now creates and holds on to the model. And the other pieces that change is when you tap the button's action, remember, is controller.changeCount. The controller just turns to the model and says, hey, update your count. And the controller displays model.count because count isn't local. And you go, model.count is not observable. This is not going to work. The app launches fine. And when I tap the button, it never updates. Ooh. But how could it? Model.count is not observable, so annotated count, which is what Vue is using, annotated count can't update. It's like having a dead parrot. So let's make model observable. That's it. I love you. And I import observation, and now it updates fine. Now, do you have this in your mind? I've just got three pieces. I've got my content view. The content view is holding onto the controller. The controller is holding onto the model. When I tap the button, I go all the way to the model and I update the count. That count's observable. Model.count inside of annotated count. So everything's updating fine. Here's where I think our minds get blown. If model is observable, then controller doesn't need to be observable. Wait, there's more. Even if model is a let. Wait, there's more. Even if controller is a struct. So my view is now holding on to, my view doesn't know anything about model. My view knows about controller. Controller is just this ordinary struct holding a let. There's nothing in here that's observable except model.count. Model is observable. Model.count, I'm getting my updates all the way from model to my view. So let's run an experiment to investigate why. So inside of controller, here's the experiment. I want to add an investigation. And in my investigation, I'm going to use a function that is part of observation. So I have to import observation. And it is called with observation tracking on change. With observation tracking on change does this. It has two closures. And in the first closure, you say, these are the things that I want to monitor to see when they change. And when one of them changes, I want you to perform this action. So in our case, I'd like to know when model.count changes. When model.count changes, I'm going to do something. And in this case, my compiler says, you can't just create model.count and leave it there. So I say, okay, go ahead and compile. When model.count changes, I'm going to print to the console. So I have the screen stuff happening through annotated count the way they always did. And in the console, I'm going to print whatever the model's count is. And so to kick it all off, when I create a new instance of controller, I'll call this investigation method and say, I'm interested in knowing when model.count changes. And when it does, I'll print to the console. So we run it. I'm going to track the model.count. So on the screen when I launch, it says the controller's count is 0. I tap the button, I get a new count on the screen, and in the console it prints count is 0. I've been happier. I tap the button again. I tap the button again. So the screen looks great. And when I ship an app, no one's reading the print statements anyway, but I do note that I only get one print and it's one behind. Those are two issues with this method that I need to think about. It prints once and it's one behind. Well, the prints once we know how to fix. We just call this thing recursively, and so after I print, I say, no, I'm still interested in knowing when model.count changes. And I could do it like this, simple recursion, or I could have it be conditional. As soon as I get a multiple of 5, stop, whatever I want. Okay? Run it again. It launches and says the controller's count is 0. I tap the button. I tap the button. I tap the button. Good news is it keeps printing. The bad news is it's always one behind. But hold on to your victories, my friends. So generally, we shouldn't use this function with observation tracking on change because it's always behind. But you know who likes to know when something will change? So that method isn't really for us, but it's a big part of the secret about what's making SwiftUI work with this observation. And so if you go back to your view code and you say to yourself, well, how does this thing know to update? Because controller.annotatedCount is this computed property in controller which isn't observable. How's this thing even know? You say, well, something like this. Controller.annotatedCount, if we look at it, depends on model.count. So it's as if we said, inside of content view, I'm interested in knowing when model.count changes, and when it changes, we're going to update text controller.annotatedCount. That's magic. SwiftUI checks this global registry and knows the things that it's keeping track of, and it knows when they've changed because what gets sent to the global registry? When something's been accessed and when something's been changed. Isn't that the coolest? And so now when we tap our button, what, a video? You betcha. Okay. I got more magic. What if this stuff is working because we're using state? State's sneaky. There's stuff in state that we just don't know. So let's get rid of state. In fact, let's make controller a let. In fact, let's pass it in from somewhere else. So the controller never changes. It's a let, it's a struct, and it must be passed in. So let's pass it in from our app, and our app looks like this, and just like before, I separate it into two pieces. And so I create my controller. You can leave the state out of this. It'll never well, I'm putting it in because I don't want to guarantee it'll never, but it'll never, anyway. Pass it into controller, and now this is absolutely magical. Controller never changes. Controller model never changes. Controller model is observable, and so when the controller's model's count changes, we get the update here in our computed property. That is stunning. But I got one more trick. And for our last trick, I want to change the count into a double. And we're going to make a slider here. It's a whole other app. Do I have to show it to you again to get applause? Let's simplify our model. This is all our model does. Our model has, our model's observable, and it has a property, which is a double, 0.0 I'm initializing it to. And I'm going to simplify the controller. I don't need my update count or anything. This is my simplified controller. It still points to the model, and inside the annotated count, I don't know if you noticed in the video, but it was an int. I hate when like it changes the number, and I didn't want to introduce a formatter. So I just took model count and I rounded it and I created an int from it and then a string from that. And so that's why you got those ints that look like in there. And so that's what I'm doing inside the controller. But really it's so that the controller sits between the view and the model. And I want to create a slider view. Outside of the content view, let's create a slider view. And so let's see, to create a slider, we have this initializer. The slider is in some range between 0 and 100, and it takes a value, and that value must be a binding to a double or something like a double. And so what we've done before is we just create a local state, but local state won't help us because content view needs to know what it needs to display in the text field. So this won't work. I could create a binding and pass it in, create the state, but that's not going to work. I have to do something with models count. And so binding is not what I want. There's a new thing called bindable. But bindable, even though it works with our add observable, bindable does not work with the properties in the observable. Bindable must bind to the observable object itself. And so I have to pass in not count. I have to pass in the observable object. I have to pass in model. And once I pass in the model, I bind to models count, $model.count. And now my value slider that sits inside of content view that is being passed the model is binding through the controller to the observable model and modifying its count. And when it modifies its count, because model's observable, I can display that through my annotated count. And I find that stunning that my controller never changes, controller model never changes. Model's count is able to change because it binds through everything. And so I see my controller's annotated count on the screen. And so what we did is we started with a state in the view. We moved it from the view into a controller, and we used combine. We changed it to using observable and then moved it to the model using observable. That's pretty far away, but we could move farther. We could move it to a persisted model using Swift Data, which uses observable, but we're not going to do that today. I'm putting this all together, of course, into a book, and you can check the website for books and videos and stuff like that, but just thank you for letting me start things off.